50 Cent has been working on this documentary for almost 2 years. The footage he has is insane. The people he got speaking about Diddy is ridiculous. And on top of that, the only place he agrees to do the interview, Rob, if you can show this, he goes and interviews with ABC. And there's an Instagram post he put up, Rob. I don't know if you have that or not. If you go on his Instagram account, he goes and does the interview about Diddy's documentary on ABC.
I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
Secret parties that were never photographed. Closed-door rooms where phones stayed silent. Late-night gatherings designed to disappear by morning. Private relationships no one ever acknowledged. Stories whispered, never recorded. Moments meant to stay hidden forever. And this time, it's not social media rumors, it's 50 Cent. After releasing a 4-part Netflix documentary on December 2nd, 2025, many believed the story was finished. It wasn't. Now in a new Netflix series, 50 Cent goes even deeper, and the names Diddy and Jay-Z keep appearing in the same private spaces. Not on red carpets, not in interviews, behind closed doors. This series doesn't shout accusations. It doesn't chase headlines. It quietly exposes patterns. Patterns of secret meetings, patterns of undocumented parties, patterns of silence that lasted for years. And once you realize how long this hidden world existed without cameras, without records, without accountability, you'll understand why this series is making people uncomfortable right now. What this series establishes first is not chaos, it's control. Before anything ever reached the public, there were meetings designed never to be seen, not accidental run-ins, not coincidence. These were moments arranged away from visibility, inside private rooms chosen for one reason only. Nothing would leave them. Private rooms, private timing. Spaces selected so schedules stayed clean and witnesses stayed limited. According to how 50 Cent presents it, these weren't casual conversations. They were contained environments built so words could exist without consequence. And inside those rooms, the same names surface quietly. Diddy, Jay-Z. It's not announced, not acknowledged, just present. The series doesn't invent dialogue. It doesn't speculate about intent. It focuses on structure, because structure tells its own story. When conversations happen where no one is watching, behavior changes, power settles, boundaries blur. People who describe being around these meetings don't talk about tension. They talk about calm, about how everything felt managed, as if everyone understood the rules without them ever being spoken. And when those meetings ended, the privacy didn't. It expanded. Closed-door parties followed, not industry events meant for cameras, not celebrations designed for headlines, restricted gatherings where entry wasn't earned through fame, but through familiarity. If you were there, you didn't ask questions. If you weren't, you were never meant to know it happened. 50 Cent presents these events as intentionally undocumented. No guest lists, no timestamps, No photos to resurface later. Nothing accidental about it. Phones weren't confiscated, they simply stayed away. Cameras didn't malfunction. They were never invited. These weren't wild nights spinning out of control. They were curated. Security filtered curiosity. Access filtered outsiders. Silence filtered everything else. And again, inside those spaces, the same figures appeared quietly. Diddy, Jay-Z, not highlighted, not explained, just there. At this point, before going deeper into what follows, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss any update as this story continues. What becomes clear is that when environments are repeatedly built to leave no record, non-absence itself becomes protection. No post the next morning, no casual mentions weeks later, no stories that grow legs, just silence. And silence, repeated often enough, stops looking accidental. 50 Cent doesn't accuse anyone of specific actions inside these spaces. He documents patterns. How often the same names appear in the same restricted environments. How familiarity replaces formality. How repetition replaces coincidence. Because when powerful people keep showing up in places designed to stay undocumented, the question isn't what happened one night. It's why those spaces existed at all. Closed-door gatherings don't just remove cameras. They remove witnesses. They remove accountability. And once you understand that these meetings and parties were built to leave nothing behind, something becomes impossible to ignore. When whatever followed later, the silence, the alignment, the unanswered questions, it didn't begin in public. It began here, in private rooms, at private times, between people who understood exactly why nothing could ever leave the room. Because when conversations never escape and nights leave no records, power doesn't need to hide afterward. It's already protected the moment the door closes. As the night moved deeper, the rules quietly changed. These weren't events meant to be seen. They began after schedules ended, after public spaces emptied, after visibility faded. Late-night parties that never appeared on any official timeline. After-hours gatherings outside normal sight. According to how the series presents it, timing was everything. The later it became, the fewer the witnesses. The fewer the witnesses, the easier it was for moments to exist without consequence. And in those hours, the same names kept resurfacing. Diddy, Jay-Z, not announced, not highlighted, just present. These weren't extensions of public events. They were separate worlds entirely. Locations shifted late. Entrances changed. What started as something ordinary quietly transformed into something private, without anyone needing to explain when or why. Phones weren't taken away. They simply stopped being used. Cameras didn't fail. They were never invited. People who remember these nights don't describe chaos. They describe atmosphere. How the room felt different once it was clear the night belonged only to a few. How familiar faces stayed while others slowly disappeared. And what remains from those nights isn't footage. It's memory. It's scenes involving Diddy and Jay-Z that survived only through recollection. Moments never posted, never acknowledged, never revisited publicly. That's what makes them powerful. Memory can be questioned, dismissed, rewritten, and in environments designed to leave no record, memory becomes the only trace and the easiest thing to challenge later. It's also in these late-night spaces that another layer stayed carefully hidden. Secret romantic relationships, not rumors shouted into the open, not confirmations placed on record. Private involvement maintained deliberately, far from public image. According to the series, connections around Diddy and Jay-Z were managed with precision. No shared appearances. No overlap between private proximity and public narrative. Two realities running parallel. Never intersecting on camera. Publicly, there was distance. Privately, there was continuity. That separation didn't happen by accident. Relationships don't stay invisible without effort. They stay invisible when everyone involved understands that acknowledgement would change everything. These connections were never acknowledged openly, never denied either. They were simply left untouched. Inside these circles, rules didn't need explanation. Where meetings could happen, when visibility had to end, which spaces were considered safe. Silence wasn't requested, it was expected. The series doesn't label these relationships as right or wrong. It asks a quieter, more revealing question. Why was public acknowledgement impossible? Why did protecting image require complete separation from private reality? Because when romantic involvement must exist entirely off record, exposure carries consequences far beyond embarrassment. Late nights made this possible. After hours, there were fewer boundaries, fewer questions, fewer people left to notice how often the same patterns repeated, and patterns did repeat. The same timing, the same environments, the same names. Over years, by the time people realized how consistent these nights were, silence had already settled in. It had already done its work. What's unsettling isn't one memory. It's how many memories share the same shape. Because when moments are designed to exist only in memory, accountability fades with time. And when relationships are kept entirely outside public view, silence becomes the strongest form of protection. These late-night gatherings weren't about spontaneity or romance. They were about control. Control over timing, control over visibility, and control over what could never be proven later. Because when nothing is recorded, everything can be denied. And when nights leave no trace, silence doesn't follow by accident. It follows by design. As the series moves forward, the tone tightens. This is where silence stops feeling neutral. The documentary approaches allegations involving young girls with extreme care, not as established facts, not as conclusions, but as moments that created discomfort long before anyone knew how to describe it. The focus isn't on graphic detail, it's on presence. Who appeared in adult-only environments, who didn't seem to belong there, and why no one felt able to ask questions at the time. Accounts describe young individuals being present in late-night settings and restricted spaces shaped by adult influence. Nothing was announced as wrong in the moment. Nothing was challenged openly, but concern existed. Age questions surfaced quietly, in side conversations that never reached clarity, in exchanged looks, in warnings that sounded vague, but carried weight. Be careful, without explanation. When names like Diddy and Jay-Z were connected to these environments, hesitation made sense. Not because anyone spoke threats, but because power doesn't need to speak to be understood. Speaking felt risky. Silence felt safer. Some people describe confusion more than certainty. Others describe recognizing imbalance immediately, but choosing not to react. Careers mattered. Access mattered. Proximity to influence mattered. So discomfort was absorbed. What makes this unsettling isn't a single recollection. It's repetition. Different people, different years, different locations, the same uneasy feeling. And the series doesn't ask viewers to decide what happened. It asks them to notice how often similar concern appeared and how consistently it went unaddressed. Then the focus shifts again into another layer of secrecy. Alleged relationships with men, not framed as scandal, not framed as wrongdoing, examined through separation, the separation between private identity and public persona. The documentary is careful here. This isn't about judging identity. It's about concealment and the extreme effort required to keep parts of life completely invisible. Public image was tightly managed, appearances calculated, associations filtered. The version shown to the world remained consistent and controlled. Behind closed doors, different rules applied. According to accounts, private connections existed only in spaces where cameras never followed and questions were never asked. No confirmations, no denials, just silence, maintained over long periods of time. What stands out is the discipline involved. Different locations, different timing, different circles. Public life and private life were never allowed to overlap. That level of separation doesn't happen by accident. It happens when exposure carries consequences to reputation, to influence, to carefully protected narratives. The series doesn't speculate on motives. It doesn't define anyone. It asks why secrecy had to be absolute, why even acknowledgement felt dangerous. Because when something must be hidden this carefully, the secrecy itself becomes revealing. People describe how trust operated inside these environments. Who could be present? Who could be relied on to stay silent? Who understood the unspoken rules without them ever being explained? Breaking those rules didn't lead to confrontation. It led to disappearance. Invitations stopped coming. Access faded. Connections dissolved quietly. Not as punishment, but as prevention. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from accusation. It comes from structure, from how power, silence, and imbalance overlapped, from how concern was noticed but never addressed, from how identity, whatever it may have been, had to remain hidden to protect something larger. Because this isn't just about relationships. It's about a system where silence mattered more than clarity. And in that system, questions didn't vanish. They waited. As the series continues, the focus shifts from secrecy to alignment. On secret relationships with celebrities, not friendships celebrated publicly, not collaborations announced on stages, but powerful names moving together quietly while appearing separate in public. The documentary shows how Diddy and Jay-Z often maintain visible distance in interviews, public events, and official narratives. Different lanes, different circles, a separation that suggested independence. But behind closed doors, that distance disappeared. Private gatherings, restricted spaces, after-hours environments where access mattered more than image. In these settings, familiar faces reappeared. The same influential names surfaced again and again. Never photographed, never acknowledged, never discussed publicly. Public distance masked private familiarity, and that contrast mattered. Public separation reduced curiosity. Private alignment preserved trust. The series doesn't claim secret deals or formal alliances. It reveals something quieter and more effective: mutual understanding. An understanding of when to stay apart publicly and when to move together privately. People inside the industry describe how reactions often felt synchronized. Certain topics went silent at the same time. Attention shifted away without explanation, not because instructions were given, but because alignment already existed. This is how influence protects itself. When powerful people share private spaces, silence becomes shared. It doesn't need enforcement. Everyone understands the cost of breaking it. Access is at stake. Reputation is at stake. Careers are at stake. And then the documentary moves into heavier territory: adult misconduct allegations. Ari claims of inappropriate behavior that have circulated quietly for years. Disturbing stories said to have occurred behind closed doors. The series approaches these accounts carefully. It doesn't sensationalize. It doesn't dramatize. It documents how these stories surfaced and why they never disappeared. What connects these accounts isn't detail. It's environment, private settings, limited witnesses, power imbalances that made speaking feel dangerous. Different people described similar unease, situations where boundaries felt unclear, moments that didn't feel right, but didn't feel safe enough to challenge. At the time, many dismissed their instincts. Later, distance brought clarity. And when multiple people reached similar realizations independently, the story stopped feeling isolated. They began to feel patterned. The documentary doesn't accuse Diddy or Jay-Z directly. It asks why these stories were never addressed openly, why explanations never followed, why silence replaced clarity every time. Because silence doesn't erase allegations like these. It preserves them. It allows questions to grow heavier instead of fading. It allows patterns to emerge where individual moments once stood alone. The series shows how private celebrity spaces can normalize behavior that would never survive public scrutiny, how repetition turns discomfort into routine, how routine slowly erodes the instinct to question, and that erosion is dangerous, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it allows environments to exist without accountability. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from one story, it comes from accumulation, from how often similar unease appears, from how consistently the same private spaces return, from how reliably silence follows. Because discomfort doesn't appear without reason, it grows where power goes unchecked, where visibility ends, where what happens behind closed doors is protected by design. And once those doors begin to open, even slightly, the story stops being about rumor. It becomes about how long public distance was used to hide private familiarity, and what silence allowed to exist in between. As the series continues, it becomes clear that the most important connections were never the visible ones. They were the ones no one talked about, unspoken connections. Private inner circles that never appeared in interviews, articles, or public narratives. To people who were consistently present around Diddy and Jay-Z across different years and different locations, yet somehow remained invisible to the outside world. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence felt permanent, familiar, almost expected. Doors opened without questions. Conversations shifted without explanation. Access wasn't requested, it was assumed. That kind of access doesn't happen by chance. It comes from trust built quietly over time. People who describe these spaces talk about how the energy changed when members of these inner circles entered the room. Voices softened, body language adjusted. Others instinctively knew where they stood, often without understanding why. Authority wasn't spoken, it was felt. What makes these connections unsettling isn't that they existed. Every powerful world has an inner circle. What makes them unsettling is how completely erased they were from the public story. No names, no acknowledgments, no record they were ever there. Yet around Diddy and Jay-Z, their presence was consistent. That absence from public awareness wasn't accidental. It was protection. The series suggests these private circles functioned as continuity. They remembered what others forgot. They understood how things worked when no one else was watching. Silence wasn't demanded. It was understood as the price of belonging. And within that same structure existed another layer. Off-record relationships, privately maintained ties that were never confirmed and never denied. Not rumors chasing attention, not stories looking for validation. Associations that existed quietly. It deliberately kept outside documentation. No statements, no clarifications, no denials, just public distance and private familiarity. Inside these circles, these relationships were treated as known realities. No one asked for confirmation. No one needed explanation. Explanation would have created records, and records were exactly what these ties could not survive. What stands out most is how long they lasted. Public narratives changed. Images evolved. Controversies came and went. The off-record relationships remained. Invisible but intact. Maintaining that level of invisibility requires discipline, coordination, a shared understanding that silence benefits everyone involved. Silence protected access. Silence protected influence. Silence protected the system. The series doesn't suggest these ties were hidden because they were fragile. When it suggests they were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to preserve privately. Valuable enough to erase publicly. Over time, this separation became normal. Public stories stayed clean. Private realities continued uninterrupted. By the end of this section, one realization settles quietly. The strongest connections around Diddy and Jay-Z weren't the ones people could point to. They were the ones no one could name, the ones never written down, the ones that existed only through proximity, access, and silence. And when relationships can survive for years without ever being confirmed or denied, they aren't accidental. They are functioning exactly as designed, protected not by lies, but by the shared understanding that some connections are never meant to be spoken out loud. As the series widens its focus, half the story stops being about isolated moments and starts becoming about movement. Hidden alliances, not partnerships announced on stages, not friendships celebrated in interviews, but coordination that only becomes visible when you look behind the scenes. Publicly, Diddy and Jay-Z appeared separate. Different paths, different narratives, different public postures that suggested independence and distance. To the outside world, there was no obvious reason to connect their actions. Privately, alignment kept appearing. According to how the series frames it, moments of public separation often match moments of private unity. Silence arrived at the same time. Attention shifted in the same direction. Certain conversations across the industry seemed to stop simultaneously, without anyone explaining why. No meetings were announced, and no agreements were documented, just understanding. An understanding of when to stay apart publicly and when to move together quietly. This is how influence protects itself when visibility becomes a risk. Behavior replaces paperwork. Timing replaces statements. Silence replaces denial. The series shows how reactions across the industry often felt coordinated without ever being coordinated on paper. Questions went unanswered at the same moment. Topics disappeared without confrontation. Curiosity was redirected softly, almost instinctively. Not because someone issued orders, because alignment already existed. Public separation wasn't accidental. It was functional. It reduced scrutiny. It scattered responsibility. It made accountability harder to locate. And within that structure, another reality never faded. In unverified but persistent accusations, claims that didn't arrive with documents or court dates, claims that didn't explode into headlines and then vanish, claims that stayed. After 50 Cent's earlier documentary, many expected resolution, clear denials, direct explanations, something that addressed the patterns openly. What followed instead was silence. No detailed responses, no clarifications, no effort to dismantle the questions. And silence doesn't erase accusations like these. It preserves them. The series traces how these claims resurfaced quietly over time, in private conversations, in careful warnings, in things people said without ever putting them on record. Different voices, different years, the same unease. Not identical stories, but familiar shapes. Private settings, limited witnesses, power imbalances, and afterward, nothing. False stories usually collapse. They lose momentum. They fade when attention moves on. These didn't. They lingered. And lingering changes how questions behave. They stop demanding belief. They start demanding attention. The series shows how unanswered claims slowly accumulate weight. Viewers begin connecting timelines, comparing environments, noticing how often the same names appear around the same silences. That lack of response becomes its own signal, because resolution doesn't require admission, it requires engagement. Here, engagement never came. Public separation continued. Private alignment remained intact. And that combination is powerful. It allows influence to operate without exposure. It allows protection without confirmation. It allows questions to exist without answers. By the end of this section, I know one realization becomes unavoidable. When alliances are hidden, accountability scatters. When questions are left unanswered, they don't disappear. They settle. They wait. And once they've waited long enough, the story stops being about whether something can be proven. It becomes about why, after that earlier documentary, the same questions were still left untouched. Because silence can protect power for a long time. But it also keeps every unanswered question alive, quietly building weight until patterns become impossible to ignore. As the series moves closer to its core, absence begins to feel intentional. Unconfirmed associations, connections that were never announced, never explained, and never denied. Publicly, they didn't exist. No interviews, no photos, no acknowledgments tying anyone together. But privately, those bonds never disappeared. The same proximity kept returning. The same access was quietly granted. The same familiarity followed Diddy and Jay-Z from one restricted space to another. What makes this unsettling isn't secrecy by itself. It's intention. Erasing a bond publicly takes effort. Preserving it privately takes discipline. Both sides have to understand the same rule. Silence protects everyone. The documentary shows how public distance became routine. Appearing unconnected reduced curiosity. It allowed questions to fade before they could fully form. Meanwhile, private access continued without interruption. Meetings still happen. Doors still open. The same faces still move freely. Inside these circles, confirmation was never requested. Denial was never necessary. So clarification would have created records, and records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. Ambiguity became armor. If something isn't acknowledged, it can't be challenged. If it isn't confirmed, it can't be disproven. If it doesn't officially exist, responsibility has nowhere to land. The series suggests these associations weren't hidden because they were fragile. They were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to maintain privately. Valuable enough to erase publicly. And within those same private environments, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Power dynamics. These spaces were never equal. Influence controlled access long before anyone entered the room. Who was invited? Who stayed late? Who felt comfortable speaking? None of it was random. People adjusted instinctively. Voices lowered. A conversation shifted. Authority didn't need to be announced. It was felt. This is where age gap concerns begin to surface, not as accusations, but as quiet alarms. Accounts describe younger individuals present in environments dominated by experience, status, and control. Late-night settings, restricted gatherings, rooms where power already leaned heavily in one direction. Nothing was officially questioned, nothing was openly challenged, but discomfort existed. People noticed imbalance. They sensed it in the atmosphere. They felt it in what wasn't said. The series doesn't describe acts. It doesn't assign intent. It examines structure. When age gaps exist alongside unchecked influence, vulnerability doesn't need to be created. It already exists. Younger individuals didn't set the rules. They didn't control the space. They didn't decide when things started or ended. Power did, and power shaped what felt possible to say and what felt impossible to challenge. Concerns surfaced quietly, in side comments, in warnings without detail. Advice like, be careful, delivered without explanation. That caution wasn't ignorance. It was fear of consequence. Because questioning power inside private spaces often meant risking access, careers, protection, and momentum. So most people chose silence, not because they agreed with what they were seeing, but because silence felt safer than disruption. Over time, silence normalized imbalance. What once felt uncomfortable became routine. What once raised alarms faded into background noise. And routine is dangerous, because when imbalance becomes normal, accountability disappears. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from proof. It comes from repetition. The same structures, the same access, the same hesitation to speak, again and again. And when private spaces are built around unchecked influence, the question stops being what happened. It becomes how much could happen, without anyone ever feeling able to stop it. Because power doesn't need permission to operate. It only needs silence. And in these spaces, silence was always present. Quiet, consistent, and protective. As the series reaches its final stretch, everything that once felt scattered begins to line up. Not into accusations, not into conclusions, but into pressure. For years, exploitation rumors moved quietly through the industry. They weren't loud enough to force action. They weren't specific enough to demand accountability. Whilst they traveled carefully, shared in private, passed in lowered voices, never meant to reach headlines. These weren't stories told for attention. They were warnings. Concerns around vulnerable individuals surfaced the same way. In pauses, in unfinished sentences, in moments where someone would start to explain and then stop. Details were avoided deliberately, because details carried consequences. What the series makes clear is that these whispers didn't drift randomly. They followed patterns, the same kinds of spaces, the same restricted environments, the same structures where access mattered more than visibility. Different years, different locations, the same discomfort. Someone would quietly express concern, only to realize someone else had noticed something similar long before. Not the same incident, but the same feeling, the same unease. The same sense that something about these spaces wasn't right. That's when coincidence stops being believable. Because rumors don't survive across years without reinforcement. They survive because silence protects them. The series shows how this system didn't need threats to function. No one had to be told to stay quiet. The cost of speaking was already understood. Access could disappear. Opportunities could fade. Careers could stall without explanation. So people chose silence, not because they believed nothing was wrong, but because silence felt like survival. This is how systems built on power protect themselves, not through denial, through exhaustion. People grow tired of carrying questions alone. They convince themselves discomfort isn't enough to risk everything. They learn to look away from what feels too large to challenge, until something changes. What changes now is visibility. With 50 Cent's new Netflix series, the whispers are no longer isolated. They're placed side by side. Patterns that once felt personal now look structural. The same environments tied to Diddy and Jay-Z are no longer invisible. The series doesn't accuse. It doesn't conclude. it connects. And connection is dangerous for any system built on silence, because silence only works when people believe they're alone. Once they realize they're not, the structure weakens. The documentary shows how repetition creates pressure, how awareness spreads quietly, how people begin to understand that what they noticed years ago wasn't isolated, it was shared. That shared recognition changes everything. The system hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer hidden. And once something built on silence becomes visible, it doesn't need to be attacked. It begins to strain under its own weight, not all at once, not dramatically, but inevitably, because silence can protect power for a long time, just not forever. Now, with this series laying these patterns out clearly, the pressure isn't coming from accusations. It's coming from awareness, from the realization that the same concerns echoed for years, that the same structures repeated without interruption, that the same questions were never answered. This isn't the end of the story, but it is the moment the system stopped being invisible. And once enough people see the same pattern at the same time, the question stops being whether something will change. It becomes how long silence can hold. Now that everyone is finally looking,